All right. It is 12:01, almost 12:02. So I think we can go ahead and get this rolling. Um, so I first just want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this incredible panel that we have. For those who don't know, I am Erin Van Zee. I'm the Communications Director at RDG Planning and Design. And I also serve on the PRSA Midwest District Board, and that is who this webinar is being hosted by. As you can see on your screen, I am joined today by a fantastic group of public relations leaders, and we are here to discuss how and when an organization should engage in public discourse around sociopolitical issues. So you joined today because we're here to kind of delve into that fine line and art of decision-making on when to or when not to speak out on controversial issues. And today we're going to explore some strategies to evaluate the risks and opportunities of doing that, how you can align your organization's values with stakeholder expectations, and craft impactful messages that resonate with authenticity. So we have a lot to cover, but before we dive in, I first want to introduce our panelists. We are joined by Jen Cho, who is the founder of Pivot Swerve, which is a consulting agency based in New York City, and has worked for numerous industries across top global agencies and brands. She is passionate about helping organizations and understands the multifaceted approach needed to engage with diverse audiences on today's public stages and build inclusive team cultures that deliver results. Jen is the former CEO of The Wing, a nationwide women's co-working organization. She draws on her own entrepreneurial success and business background to guide organizations into their next chapter. Next, we have Monique Farmer, APR. She is the president of Avant Solutions and founder of Anvil Ready, an online communication strategy builder helping communications professionals. Monique teaches PR at the University of Texas at Austin. She previously served as the Director of Communications for Nebraska's largest school district and corporate communications for ConAgra Foods, which is now ConAgra Brands, and spent 10 years in public affairs with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And last but certainly not least, we have Kevin Waetke, APR Fellow PRSA. He is the Associate Vice President of Corporate Marketing at Sammons Financial Group, which is a privately held financial services firm. He plays a critical role in defining and delivering clear and consistent messages to both internal and external audiences, with a primary focus on branding and crisis and reputation management. Kevin served 2 terms on PRSA's national board and the PRSA Foundation. He currently serves on the PRSA Governance Committee and the College of Fellows Induction Ceremony Committee. And I am so excited to have all of them joining us today. Just by their bios alone, you know, they're very well equipped to answer the questions and talk about this topic. So without further ado, I think we should just go ahead and get started. Just so everyone knows, we have about 40 minutes planned for discussion with the panelists, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation that you want to address to the panelists, feel free to put those in a Q&A, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. All right, so first, let's go ahead and start with setting a little bit of groundwork. We all know and probably have felt over the last several years, if not before then, that it's becoming more and more important for people and consumers to have their CEOs or brands speak out or have positions on particular issues. I was doing some research before this, and there was a Sprout Social survey that revealed that more than 70% of consumers believe brands should take a stand on social topics. But of course, we can't all be Ben and Jerry's, right? So it's impossible for us to speak out on every single topic. And depending on your organization, that can be kind of a difficult thing to navigate. But as PR professionals, we play a really important role in guiding our organizations through that complex terrain. So Jen, I want to start with you. How can we as PR professionals effectively assess the potential risks and benefits of advocating for socio-political issues on behalf of our organizations or clients?
Erin, thank you for having me here today to talk about this topic that I do believe will continue to be a topic of conversation for us in our industry. And to get at the first question, there isn't necessarily a perfect answer for each company that's one size fits all, but I do think there are some guidelines that we can look at to try to make an assessment on whether or not we speak out and what we're talking about. And I think the first thing is understanding who your people are. So who are your customers, who are your clients, but also most importantly, who are your employees? Where are they coming from? What do they believe in? And I think that rolls into who you are as a company. I think it's a people first conversation, but of course we have to balance the business for the work that we do. So as a company, what do you stand for? What are your values? What impact do you have on the world? What does your business actually do? I think those are the two main categories that you start with. I think that's something that, you and your client should be talking about as you get into these conversations. It's like a fundamental part of your comms planning, right? I think the next part gets a little more complicated. So, if there is a topic at hand, is there an impact or an influence that you can have to that conversation? Or is this just something that you just want to talk about? You talked about Ben and Jerry's. There are a lot of companies, sure, not everybody can do that, but, does you as a company saying something actually have like a meaning? Like, does it have a result, right? I think that's what you would have to think about. Then you think about, okay, you talked about raising money, like, legislation, like what is that action? And does that action align with the business goals of your organization, right? So I think those are kind of some of the fundamental pillars. And then once you're in that room and deciding like, hey, like, yes, check all three boxes. Like we must say something on this. What is that message? Being respectful of the first three topics, like kind of pillars that I was talking about. And then who are your voices? I think that last piece is also really critical. You just need to make sure that the right people are aligned. You have the right spokespeople ahead of time that makes sense for the message that you're putting out into the world.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great advice. And not easy to do, but certainly a good stepping stone and a starting place for when deciding. Kevin, in your experience, what's a good way to kind of evaluate the risks and potential benefits of this decision-making process?
Yeah, I think to pick up where Jen left off, a company should not be expected to speak out on every issue. There is that, do I add value to the conversation? Because if you're not adding value to the conversation, there's two risks. And part of this is risk management. You could be the boy who called wolf time after time after time, and your key audiences start to tune you out if you're always advocating for some issue that is not really tied to the benefit of your people or your industry. The other risk is one of brand building. If you're perceived as someone who's only taking a point in the sand to build brand, to be present, to be in the news cycle, your organization is going to be perceived negatively. So to Jen's point, what is the industry that you need to be aligned with, and what value do you bring? And we do that at Sammons Financial Group by it's a vulnerabilities assessment. We imagine, a 4-square matrix where you have events that are highly likely to occur, and if they did, they'd have high impact. Those are the issues you should be concentrating on. And certainly socio-political issues are issues to manage in that enterprise risk management environment.
Wonderful. Thank you. Monique, I want to turn to you because you have a lot of varied experience. And in that experience, what strategies have proven effective in kind of what we were talking about, which is aligning an organization's values with those stakeholder expectations, but also maintaining that strong PR and communication strategies? How do you kind of align all of those things together?
Yeah, Erin, it's a great question. Thank you so much. And thanks to Midwest District for inviting me to be a part of this conversation this afternoon. I think a couple of points that have been made by Jen and Kevin that are so important to re-emphasize is just the organization making sure that they're always aligning with who they are, right? Who we are, well, how we are is who we are as an organization. And so really understanding and listening to employees, and then thinking about those stakeholders comprehensively and what unique benefit it is that we bring to the market in the first place as an organization, and discerning whether we have license to make a statement about that particular topic is important. But I really do think it's a proactive strategy that starts well before something hits the fan and now you have to make a decision. Because if you know who you are, just like we know who we are as people, then we have this visceral reaction to, I can't just sit here quietly and watch that happen without speaking up and saying something. And so when we think about the role of, particularly of a CCO inside of an organization, we initially want to make sure that we're initiating across that entire C-suite to define, reaffirm that enterprise's corporate character. We make sure that we've got that alignment so that it is a lot less difficult to navigate that terrain and that conversation in that C-suite. I also firmly believe that, you know, as PR practitioners who are providing advice and counsel, we have an obligation to help organizations. We have an obligation to be a conscious inside the organization and really help that organization understand and get back to center about when it's appropriate to speak out about something or when it's not. And that comes from, you know, listening instruments that help us assess and keep a pulse on our organization and on our stakeholders. So once we have initiated and gotten that C-suite aligned, we also are oftentimes in a position to build a framework and help with application inside of culture. What does that look like? If we are playing within these pillar spaces, if you will, what does that look like for us as an organization as we live out our corporate character? And then, you know, it never hurts to make a friend before you need a friend. I like to say that a lot when we think about crisis comms, right? You may not want to stand alone inside of a space where you're going to make a comment about something. I know that it was common practice for me in a good handful of positions I had to have a good pulse on what others across that industry were doing or saying within a particular space. So I think, you know, getting partners and then continuing that listening cycle. There's one more just piece of anecdote that I want to offer to this conversation about strategies that have proven effective. And it came out of some research that I have had the privilege of partnering with a colleague out of Penn State to work on, and we presented it at a crisis communication conference in Florida last March. But we actually just went through and conducted an assessment in the aftermath of the George Floyd incident and looked at all 30 Dow companies to assess their statements and what it was that they put out to the public in response to that. I feel like at that time, so many companies felt obligated to speak up, whether, you know, it was, I think it was in alignment with a lot of companies' values, but the act that we all witnessed on public television, because it was so egregious, I think really hit home for a lot of organizations that as a collective nation, we couldn't stand by and not speak up. But it was interesting to us how many companies basically put points on the board in terms of saying, not only do we condemn this action, but this is what we're going to do about it. And so many of them, you know, out of all 30, we only surfaced 3, and I'll name them, Cisco, Visa, and Coca-Cola, who essentially said, you know, we not only do we condemn this, but we are going to make conscientious, measurable efforts to be representative on our boards and across our workforce, in terms of, you know, how many Black employees we have represented, how many minority employees. We're going to make a conscious effort to contribute to economic development in communities across our nation who maybe have been left out of that cycle or had opportunities. Not only are we going to say something, but we're going to do something.
Yeah. So it sounds like making sure that you are not only in tune with the C-suite of your organization or understanding, you know, what the values of the organization are, but if you do choose to speak out, that it's not just doing it to do it, that you actually put some sort of action or you have some sort of influence behind it that means something, and it's not just words. Jen, I wanted to get your kind of your input on that as well in terms of strategies that you've used to align and organize your, whether your organization or an organization that you've worked with, the values and stakeholder expectations, while still having that like effective communication strategy in place.
Yes, so Monique had some really great gems in there for those listening to the webinar, and I++, all of the work that she's doing. But just to highlight some things that I do think require like a walkthrough when it comes to planning, it's all about being proactive. When we talk about the socioeconomic issues of today, they do exist in buckets. They are predictable in some type of way, right? Like as a category, we can't predict exactly the incident, but there are categories that we can use to create, I don't want to call it a crisis comms plan. I think the lines between crisis versus comms planning are blurred. It's just planning in general and just being ready with everything that we talked about, like all of the right, like what are we talking about? Who is saying what we're saying? And then most importantly, the last study that Monique was talking about, we live in a world that's fully transparent. People are watching, right? So I think the words that we need to use are, you cannot be performative, you must be authentic, right? And you have to have a transparency to that. So that again goes back to planning. Like, what are you doing as a business to communicate this with your internal employees, right? That's part of the comms planning process. I think a lot of people kind of skip to external when it comes to crisis comms, but they really need to test the waters with their internal comms so that it's not something new, that it doesn't feel performative, that your employees will be your ambassadors and be your will co-sign what you are saying when that crisis and that moment of crisis happens, right? So it's really just adding to everything that Monique was saying, but I think the planning nowadays has become much more complicated and requires a lot of intentionality in making sure that you're planning with a larger audience of stakeholders. So C-suite executives for sure, but I do think that there are a number of different ways that you can listen to your internal teams, everything from ERG groups to different, listening sessions or town halls, so that you can get ahead of what the expectation is from your employees, because those are the people that you're going to have to really convince before you convince the public.
Yeah, all excellent points. I think it is really easy to focus heavily on that external piece, but our internal audiences are equally as, if not more important, because they really drive the culture of our company, and they're going to be the ones most impacted likely by any statements that we make or the communication strategy that we're putting out. So thank you for highlighting that, Jen. Kevin, I want to turn to you for just a second to talk about kind of in your experience and your thoughts on how PR professionals can ensure that their messaging, if they do choose to speak out on those socio-political issues, how they can make sure that that messaging is consistent and authentic across the different platforms and channels they're using, and make sure that it stays true to who they are as an organization.
Yeah, two very important words: consistent and authentic. And for my company and in my experience everywhere I've worked, what I brought to the table is, what are our core messages? Core messages have to be tied to your company's core values. And I guarantee everybody has a website, everybody has mission statements, vision statements, purpose statements, core values. What does the company believe in? And I would say for my company, we have about 2,000 employees. Everyone can state the 4 core values of accountability, integrity, openness, and respect. And in a vacuum, those are meaningless words. Your company gives those words its personality. So if you talk about accountability, how can we be accountable to impact the discussion on this matter in an affirming way? Or in integrity, on a human level, why does this issue matter at all? And why are we making the statement? So that's what's really critical about consistent and authentic messages, because to come out on an issue that doesn't tie back to your core values will seem random to your audiences and will become very inauthentic, in my opinion, and in my experience.
Yeah. So using the brand identity as it is already to help guide those messages and rooting those messages is really critical, and having that authenticity. Monique, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I'm kind of laughing inside, Kevin, because one thing that I've seen time and time again on comms teams, unfortunately, is we have that core messaging, right? Like, we all know it, we have it, we might even have it on a pocket guide, but it just, it tickles me sometimes how even comms people will just start writing something new from scratch. Like we don't know that we have messaging. It's a sheet of music that we're supposed to use, not just put on a shelf. And maybe we adapt it, but it's the reason why we do planning in advance and why proactive consideration of some of these potential vulnerabilities is so important, so that we have already pressure tested, if you will, and gotten the consensus across the leadership on this is how we want to talk about who we are. So I just challenge all comms people to get to your sheet of music before trying to start from scratch, because it's eating a bunch of time and energy that you may not necessarily need to eat. The additional thought that I would add to what Kevin said is that I think we also want to consider, when we're trying to ensure that we have consistency across those channels, we really are putting into license, I think, those internal audiences to become brand ambassadors. And that's something we have to intentionally empower our employees to do. We have to have policies and guidelines. I know there's been times when I've done those explainer videos that help people understand what their role is when they're speaking to friends, when they're speaking to family members about who their company is that they work for, especially because if people see something about your organization in the news and they have a neighbor who works there, guess what? They're just going to ask them, what is really going on there, right? Because they know they're going to get the scoop. And if you have empowered and enrolled your employees as ambassadors and given them accurate, timely information, they can really, really help dispel some of the misinformation that might be at the ground level. And then the other piece of thought that I would offer to that is ensuring that that conversation is not just one-dimensional or asymmetrical, that it's a two-way conversation. That, not are we just putting information out, but we're listening, we're updating messaging based on what we're hearing in terms of questions, whether it's from employees or other stakeholders, but that we continue to maintain a decent pulse on what is being said about us, what the sentiment is, if there's information that's accurate or not, if we've got our reputation management professionals on our team out there monitoring that and feeding us back information and helping to make sure that the information about us is accurate and timely.
Yeah, wonderful. I also really love referring to our comms messages as sheets of music. I'm definitely going to use that. And I think, yes, like so important to make sure that we are engaging our people so that if someone does ask them a question, they can provide the same message that the company is providing. It's such an important point. Jen, in your experience, are there some best practices that you can share with the PR pros on this call when it comes to navigating those controversial or sensitive socio-political issues? How can we manage public perception and protect our organization's reputation while we're doing that? Are there some best practices that you've identified?
Yes, I do think that everything that we're talking about, is like fundamental to be able to protect and defend, but then also drive the impact that consumers and employees want to see from their companies. So I think we've talked about a lot of the fundamentals that we need. I will say that we've touched on this, Monique, you just talked about this. So employees for sure, but the other part is our partners. So if you're doing the work, instead of just writing a check, you need to really engage with the partners that you're working with and have some results from that work, right? Like the impact. And you need to be able to do enough of that work so that when or if something happens and your authenticity is questioned, you have people that will rally to your defense. Your employees are your first line of defense. But I do think that partners that come into the fold, whether they're your social impact partners, nonprofits that you've worked with, or external companies that you're aligned with or your industry, also understand exactly who you are, what you're doing, the work you're doing, and can come out and support you. That's not to say that every company is at the same level of like work, or they've done the same body of work across all of the different topics that could come up in our future. There are so many that can be very, very dangerous, but I do think it's important to make sure that you're being transparent with those partners, tracking that information, tracking that data, sharing those wins, but then also if there are learnings that are uncomfortable, sharing those learnings and talking about what you're going to do to address those learnings.
Great advice. Monique, anything on that you want to add?
I apologize. I was replying to one of the questions in the
No,
chat.
you're good.
So that said, I'm just going to agree with what Jen said because she's been
Perfect.
consistent.
That's great. No, we could go to the to our actually the next question I have for you, Monique, builds on that last question. So when you're advising organizations, whether it's, you know, in your role as an agency leader or even within corporate communications, your experience there, when advising organizations on those socio-political issues, what's the best way to strike a balance between taking a principled stand and then considering that potential impact on, you know, the company's bottom line, which for good or bad is something we all have to think about, right? How do you strike a balance between those two things?
That's a great question. And again, it's a tough question. It's a situation room discussion. I still think it comes back to center about who the organization is and getting that alignment across your leadership. I think it's so important to have pre-mortem discussions about some of these things also. And that's where we're really assessing and pressure testing the worst case scenarios, right? Or we're thinking about, okay, what are the different courses of action that might unfold if we do A, B, C, or D, and then collectively reaching a consensus about the direction we want to head. And we've seen companies do that. Externally to us, it looks pretty fearless. I remember when CVS took all of the tobacco off of their shelves, and we know that was a bottom line loss for them to make that decision, but it's a principled stand about who they are as a company. We're all familiar with Chick-fil-A being closed on Sunday, no matter how bad you want those chicken nuggets. They took a principled stand to say, we're a company who values family time and people having an opportunity to attend their religious services. So we're going to take that risk and not make that money on Sunday to give our employees that time. Those are the kinds of principled stands I think that companies can consider that can be calculated. They potentially, I would presume they know exactly how much money they were going to lose making that decision, but the trade-off to them was more important. Companies who have to face decisions about things like food recalls, there is a lot of money involved when food gets recalled, or any product for that matter gets recalled. But it goes back to, who are we as a company? How do we want to be perceived? What's more important? And then often I think companies who have been through those decision-making processes would agree that over the long haul, the decisions that they make that adhere to their values and who they are, especially if we can even think about ESG goals, investors, I think they clearly understand that those companies fare better over time and make more money because they are principled and valued, and it's more than bottom line.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jen, anything to add from you on that?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of great guidance there. I'll actually go the other way and share a terrible example.
We love terrible examples. So informative.
The Chick-fil-A example, I can respect it. They defined what they wanted to do, like Monique said, and they stood by it, regardless of what other people had to say. Terrible example, Anheuser-Busch and Dylan Mulvaney. So if something were to happen like that, I hope no one's on the call that's from that comms team, but it was a double negative, right? Like it came out, the marketing came out, the backlash came out from the stakeholder audience. And instead of owning it and saying, okay, this is the progression of our company and our org, despite whatever financial losses could have been predicted, they actually blamed an employee, tried to revert on like what they were doing, which created a double negative. So they were basically canceled by both sides, right? Like if I happened to be at that organization, I would look at the demographic of the future and I would say, look, like we are this and we did this. We support our employees. We support our marketing team. This was a great decision. It was collaborative. Let's be real. Not one person gets to sign off on that. We all know that. We all work in the industry, right? I support my team. I support my employee. And they probably would have gotten some rallying from the people that supported Dylan, right? They would have gotten at least one side to support them and potentially create a new line of business or define a different future for them. But if you're looking at what's happening, they did neither, right? And that's what not to do. So just sharing.
Also
Yeah,
just
that's
so
a good
important.
example. Yeah. It actually dovetails great into the next question, Kevin, which is for you, and that the whole conversation about internal teams. And I
Mhm.
don't know what those conversations looked like at Anheuser-Busch, but the end was not probably what they had hoped for. And so I think it brings up this important point about how can we as communications professionals effectively collaborate with those other internal stakeholders, the legal teams, senior executives, even people on our own teams, to ensure that our message is unified and well coordinated, especially when we're deciding whether or not to speak out on those somewhat controversial issues.
Yeah, and I love this part because communication pros, to Monique's point, are the conscience of the organization. They also galvanize thought. So often, senior leaders are brilliant, but they can't find the words to articulate the message that they want to share that can resonate with your thousands of employees or your external audiences. So that's why when you talk about corporate emergency response, communications has to be part of it, because they can take all these random thoughts and put them together into a narrative, and that's what we're paid to do. And I find that so exciting. And what I will add to Jennifer's point is that if in that process you feel a sense of disconnection time and time again, that your words, your feelings are not being reflected at the end result, then that's a red flag to you as a communicator. And you may not be in a good environment if they're not recognizing the value you're bringing. So that's a tough conversation, but certainly what's unique about my company is we have this beach ball, and we always talk about what stripe are you on the beach ball. We all bring our unique personalities to the conversation, and that's why diversity and inclusion is critical, to have all these voices represented, put all of that content out there, work through all of that content, and then galvanize. What is our message going to be? And hopefully, you can't run everything through a consensus filter, but for the most part, you want to have a sense of consensus before you go out and share a message. You cannot have disagreements, distractions, and infighting in that alignment of internal stakeholders.
Yeah, so important. Easier said than done, but absolutely critical to making sure that your messages are going out in the way that you want them, and hopefully being received in the way that you want them, and also reflective of a collective sort of vision for what that response will be. Monique, any thoughts from you on that, and how we as communications professionals can collaborate with those internal stakeholders?
Yeah, one process that I've used on more than one occasion is message mapping, and it's exactly what Kevin is describing. You bring the different stakeholders in the room. Sometimes some of them are even external if you built that trust as an organization, to bring some of those people in to really help you galvanize those words and pull them out of that team and have them all agree together that this is the core messaging we all collectively agree into. You get that buy-in on the front end before you're in a position where you need to use that externally approved messaging. And so that does create a sense of togetherness. Everybody's had their opportunity to weigh in. You do it on the fly. They can see it on the board live as it's coming to life. And then you all leave with a sheet of music that you agree is what you want to use. So I just offer that thought. He was describing it perfectly. And that's one of the values add, I think, that we do bring as comms professionals, because we tend to know how to work magic with words, and sometimes really on the fly.
Yeah, it's a unique skill, and I think one that's super valuable to organizations, whether they always know it or not. So this is a question for all of you, and Jen, I'm going to have you answer first. So in terms of your experience, are there any practical tools that you've used or that you can recommend? We want to leave people with a few sort of tangible things they can take away from this. Any practical tools that you've used, like as a helpful guide in advising organizations on matters like this?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and of course, any of the foundational tools that we use as communicators, I think, are relevant. we love the word playbook. I do think that we live in a world where playbooks are only as good as the next playbook. So I will say that I'm looking forward to a lot of musical sheets, that are specific to each company. But, it's wrapped up in kind of what I think we need to just trust is you need to trust your training as a communicator. I think if we can stand by the traditional principles of what communication is meant to do, what it's supposed to do, and the impact it's supposed to have, then, with some of the topics that we've talked about today, communicators need to trust their expertise. So I'll leave it at that.
I love that. I think it's, again, another thing easier said than done, but super valuable. And why we're in the room, right? That's why we're there. Kevin, what about you? Any practical tools that you've used?
Yeah, a couple. And this really comes down to team building. So you got to establish trust first, right? You need to respect the individuals. So you should go through a series of team building. And so we've done strength finders, which is great to know how people are wired. But one we just worked on as a whole team was called Working Genius by Patrick Lencioni. And this actually gets not into how you get stuff done, but the personality type and where do you excel? Are you, full of wonder and ideation, or are you more tenacious and you get things done? Do you galvanize? There's an acronym widget, and what it does is it assigns people a couple of letters, and this is a strength. And where you don't fare well is not a weakness, but rather it's just a frustration. It's a couple of places where you don't necessarily feel joy in doing every day. And honestly, if you're going to work as a communications person and you're not enjoying 80 to 90% of your job, then I would say you might want to find a new job. That's what this Working Genius gets into. And it's the perfect tool to step into a team and start to say, okay, where do we excel? Where do we get frustrated? And really helps you to focus on internal and external drivers. And it also allows you to understand, is that person thinking objectively about the assignment at hand, or are they too close to it? And when you're talking about socio-political issues, you're going to have those moments where you need to step back and be objective. You need to, passion as much as possible, but professionalism has to play in there too.
Yep, great point. Monique, what about you?
Yep, no, I co-sign on both thoughts. I just add that one of the places I looked even to prep for today's conversation was Arthur Page Society. And so that is membership based. However, there's still a treasure trove of accessible free information there. And even though it's about several years old now, they have a Building Belief. It was that new model for activating corporate character. It's a guidebook that is free. It's downloadable. That's really good. And I shamelessly shared some of the thoughts from there that leaders can use to help their companies define and activate corporate character. But then they also have a different guidebook called the Stakeholder Capitalism and ESG Multi-Stakeholder Approach that's not necessarily directly involved with decision-making with regard to social political issues, but the approach helps communicators understand how all stakeholders can benefit from company operations and the way that they approach navigating issues like that. That stakeholder approach could be helpful. So I can give you the links to where I pulled that stuff down so that we can share it with this afternoon's listeners after we conclude. But then I would also just agree with Jen about playbooks and toolkits. Got to have your playbooks and toolkits. We got to have people aligned, because even if we have these meetings, I feel like sometimes people forget, or to Kevin's point, they are so passionate about something that they maybe are too close to the issue, or they might be a part of the demographic that the issue involves. And so I think getting into agreement about what our stance is as an organization, and then even providing leaders across the team with a toolkit of, what our values are, how we're going to communicate the core messages with regard to that issue. For me, that has saved me in a lot of instances. Because it's like, hey, we all agree this is where we are. We even may have a person or two who's kind of like, but then it's like, we have to present a united front as a leadership team in front of the workforce and in front of our external stakeholders. So just enrolling there, I feel like toolkits have been helpful in the past. At least I can speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say shamelessly that the way that I discovered who would be great for this panel was through a PRSA article that was written in 2020, and each of the panelists provided some really great insight into what's appropriate and when to speak out on certain issues. 2020 offered a lot of opportunities and discussion opportunities on whether that was appropriate. And so I think the PRSA website is super helpful for that topic, especially for communications pros. I will also say that at RDG, we use sort of this like decision tree, essentially, that actually asks a lot of the same questions that we've kind of talked about here, especially as it relates to alignment in our values, but also our influence and our ability to impact a particular issue. And I can share the link to that with this group afterwards as well, because that's been something that's been, to Kevin's point, super helpful in taking the subjectivity out of that decision making and really kind of having an objective overlay to help us better decide when it's appropriate and when we maybe need to stay silent, or has been discussed here, partner with someone to make an impact, but not necessarily be out on the front lines. So I want to leave enough time for some questions, some Q&A. So there's a couple of questions in the Q&A right now. If you do have any, feel free to put them in the chat. But before we move to that section, I just want to have each one of you, if you have any additional advice, anything we haven't talked about yet today that you think would be super useful for this group here when it comes to engaging in public discourse on hot button issues. And Monique, I'm going to start with you. So any last words of wisdom before we move into the Q&A portion?
Yeah, I'll just speak from experience, Erin. I feel like one of the things that has really helped me in leadership roles to provide advice and counsel to organization, for me, it's been communication audits. Like I have brought in professionals to conduct or redux communication audits across an organization of more than 10,000 employees. And it really gave me a good read of who our employees were, but not only just employees, but external stakeholders too. And it's just so interesting to watch. There are differences, right, in terms of what's being asked of the organization. And it can make it difficult for the organization to know which direction to head. You really have to understand what the priorities are. And it's almost similar, I think, to what we have to do when we're creating messaging. We have like a myriad of stakeholders, but when we're writing the messaging, sometimes we just have to hone in on the primary, the secondary, or the tertiary audiences and speak to them, because your messaging can get very diluted if you feel like you're trying to speak to everyone. So I feel like the communication audits surface intelligence, not only about how people prefer to get their information, but what they think about you as an organization and what you're doing well and what you need to fix and who they are. And so I would just recommend, doing those and having that information on a regular basis, depending on the kind of organization you are and how quickly you progress in terms of introducing innovations or changing or strategic direction. I think it's helpful to just really revisit getting that intelligence on a regular enough basis that you know what is expected of those stakeholders and you're not guessing.
Yeah, that's great. Communication audit, something we should all do, I think. Jen, how about you? Any final words of wisdom for the group before we go into Q&A?
Yeah, just one thing, we've shared a lot of industry expertise, and we've heard a lot of great guidance today. But I do encourage everybody to really be a human being. I think that's something that we all as professionals sometimes don't trust, but ultimately socioeconomic issues are human issues. So I encourage everyone to really try to eliminate any bias when trying to see the other person's perspective or the perspective of the audience that is impacted or at the issue at hand. I think that's a guiding factor, right? We all want to be good human beings in the world. We all protect our professional and personal brands in that way. And I think when there is a moment of decision or confusion, I think people should really trust their human instinct.
I love that. We are all human and everybody isn't perfect. And we also just need to, I think that's a huge part of being authentic, right? Is not just, we're not using ChatGPT to write our responses to these things. We are hopefully using ourselves, because that's a big part of it. Kevin, what about you? Any last nuggets?
Yeah, I think to Jennifer's point, lead with kindness. Yeah, I've been around, I've been a member of PRSA since 1992. So I can guarantee in the last 20 to 30 years, society is more polarized. It just is. There is less subjectivity and more, this is my lane, this is what I feel, coming to odds with the opposite side. So just understand that going into it and lead with kindness. And, you know, just fundamental to that training is, if I know I'm going into a potential area of conflict, I'm going to start with acknowledging that this person has an opinion. To Jen's point, be a person, you know, acknowledge it. And you often won't be able to change a person's opinion, but acknowledging that they have an opinion and they're going down a different path than you might be thinking is best for your organization. Just put that out there and entertain it with kindness.
Great advice. And actually, I think that leads really well into a couple of the questions that we have in the Q&A. So there are two different questions, but they both kind of relate to the same thing, which is how you handle situations where stakeholders have divergent perspectives on what action is necessary, whether it's like, whether you should, or, you know, are there people in your company who agree or don't agree with particular issues or speaking out on particular issues? The example used in the question was woke versus anti-woke stakeholders disagreeing about DEI related issues. Some people would want the company to take a stance on things, and some people would prefer that the company did not do that. So the first part of the question is, how do you handle those situations where you have that divergent sort of perspective from your stakeholders, and how do you determine the best way to move forward? And I will let you all, like whoever wants to jump in first, please do so.
I will jump in. I will just go back to my core values. How can you defend your position through your core values? That's where the narrative starts. And just understand, again, Monique said it very, very well. PR and communications is the organization's conscience. So get some words down on paper and walk through it with audiences on both sides. And I would, for a company perspective, start internal and get on the same page before you take anything external.
Mm-hmm.
Erin, I would piggyback off of that I feel like in my personal experience, it is more helpful than not to have strong leadership who is unafraid to be decisive about the position and the direction. It's so helpful for the rest of the people who have to work underneath that. I feel like, and when I say strong leaders, I mean leaders who are intrepid about, this is the direction, this is, you know, I'm going to walk the talk. And I think probably more often than not, when we see some of what seems like a nebulous approach to things, I would presume that there's probably a question about the kind of leader you have inside of that organization. Because I think when people know they have a strong leader who's going to give them cover, they feel empowered to move forward with the direction. But when the leadership seems like it's nimble, it does not create a stable foundation for those who have to make a decision about what are we supposed to say? What are we supposed to do? So I would offer that.
Yeah, and that kind of goes to the next question, which is sort of piggybacking off of that, was what if you have a senior leader in the organization whose personal beliefs conflict with the messaging that your company is putting out there? How do you kind of reconcile with either that sort of like the disparate ways that are kind of, that you're dealing with that. What's a good way to kind of, as a communicator, bridge the gap between, someone's personal beliefs and maybe the way that the company is responding to particular issues?
Get started on that one. I think everything that we've talked about is all about building consensus. As human beings, not everyone is going to come from the same place and agree exactly on everything. That's not just about PR or comms or messaging. That's about business decisions. This is what leadership teams do every day. If a CEO or a board is building a leadership team, the goal is not to have one opinion. It's literally important to create different voices, different perspectives, because that's the only way a business thrives. That's the only way an organization thrives. So you almost have to expect that whatever the end decision will ultimately be a decision that the team makes collectively. And there will be people that will have to, even though their personal beliefs are their personal beliefs, have to put those aside. And as a business leader in that organization, support the decision of the company. I do think that it's important, like Monique said, to have a specific, like the CEO, while leading the leadership team, needs to be ready to say, okay, we agree on this. This is what we agreed on. If you disagree, then that's a problem. Like, as my leadership team, you need to come along with me. That CEO also needs to be able to speak to the other stakeholders that are not in the room, board members, investor relations people, whatever the external audience is. So I think that leaders nowadays are responsible for so much more than just the business. I think it's important to have a strong leader, but I also think it's important to understand that there's never going to be 100% consensus. But as a leader, you need to make sure that you're supporting what your leadership team and your CEO, board, all of your stakeholders have decided is the best path forward.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. I'm going to use the R word, research. We're communications people. Bring in some data to your CEO. And I think this answers the next question that I saw in the chat as well. But if you have someone who is unable to move off that platform, demonstrate through research what current thinking is. For example, if you have external audiences, you can do pulse surveys, you can do focus groups, you can bring that to the conversation, especially if it's a longer term issue you're trying to solve for. And if a CEO says, I feel this way, but I work for an insurance company, but our population of 12,000 agents feel this way, then that just sends more objectivity. You can share the research, and you can also do some best practices. Well, here's what our competitor analysis demonstrates, and work with the strategy teams to put that together for longer term, bigger issues.
Yeah, that's great. We have a question about agency work. So Jen and Monique, I think you both are uniquely positioned to answer this one. In an agency setting, clients tend to be focused on goals and KPIs primarily. How can we convince our clients that these conversations and planning for this type of communication is important and worth our time?
Monique, I'll get started over here.
Yeah.
But I think that it's, again, this is not a separate topic from general comms planning with your clients in general, right? This is planning for, it's not crisis comms, it can be crisis comms, it can be general messaging. I think it needs to be folded into more of the general body of work versus being seen as something separate, because it's not separate. It will impact your business. It will impact your brand. It will impact your customers and your internal employees, right? So I think it's important to just, if you need examples, like Kevin was saying, if you need best case, worst case scenarios, sometimes fear is a driver for clients, unfortunately. I would definitely suggest having some competitor examples ready to go to ensure that this conversation is folded into your general planning.
Yeah, and then the only, I just offer also, and Kevin's hit on it, research. We don't have to guess, right? There are plenty of other case studies. We can look across an industry and look to see what are the top issues that this industry has run into in the last 5 years, for instance. What do we project are going to be issues into the next year or so? It's about proactive preparation. And I think we have an obligation to advise our clients about what could happen there. I saw Mark Story's question too about bringing best practices. And then, you know, if we're in an emotional, if we're in a high emotion kind of situation, having our leadership, you know, kind of go away from what we all talked about or disagree, because it is emotional. Certainly been there. What I'd offer to that, just anecdotally, Mark, and I do have a story, I won't go in depth, but I feel like we still have to advise and say, this is what I presume will happen if we head this direction. And unfortunately, sometimes when we're not the ones who make the final say, it just has to unfold. I've seen that happen a couple times, and then I've built trust that way because it's like, we already talked about what would happen if we did this way. You did it that way. This happened. And fortunately for me, that did buy me trust to be in the room more often after that incident unfolded the way that I advised and cautioned against. So I think we still do our jobs, and then, you know, we're kind of there sometime to do cleanup too, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's hard, but I think to your point, Monique, yeah, we just have to do what we're there to do. And sometimes, unfortunately, we can't control the outcome or what the leadership of our organizations or the leadership of our clients are deciding. But we can at least do what we could do and do it well and give them the best advice possible. We are coming up on the hour, so I just want to offer the opportunity for you all to do one last words of wisdom before we leave. If there's anything that you haven't addressed in the Q&A or anything that we didn't address in our panel discussion here, any last bits that you want to make sure you give to people before they leave today so they can go out and do their best work. Kevin, I'll start with you.
Sure, I would just say trust your gut. If you're not comfortable with the response you're getting or the interaction you're having, think through it, and you know if the message that you're sharing with your internal external audiences is something you're aligned with. And if it's not, have a conversation and put that out on the table.
Great. Jen, what about you?
Yeah, I think I agree with Kevin. You know, the only other thing I'll add is create a circle of trust for yourself. Hopefully other communicators, other people that, you know, you can leverage their experience and use them as a sounding board as we navigate the complicated world that we live in.
Love it. Monique, what about you?
I'd say how you are is who you are as an organization. I think, unfortunately, sometimes leaders are so far away from what's happening on the ground inside of an organization that they may not really know who they are, and they may have a brand that they think is this, but then when you really start to dig into the organization, that's not the experience that people are having. So I'd say how you are is who you are, know who you are, know who you want to be, and close the gap.
Great advice. Well, I want to say thank you to each of our panelists today. I know I learned a ton from this conversation. So grateful to have you here joining us today. I believe we'll be sending out a follow-up email with some of the resources that we mentioned in here, as well as the recording of this session. So if you want to go back and watch, if you missed something or you want to hear something again, you'll have the opportunity to do that. Again, thank you so much to all of our panelists, Kevin, Jen, Monique. This was wonderful. We just really appreciate your time. And I think that is it for the day. So hopefully you go out and you've taken some things from this that you can apply to your day-to-day practice. And we appreciate all of you attending and joining us for this important discussion. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much.
You have a great rest of the week.